I was trained as a social psychologist to begin with your theory and then operationalize your research questions and produce your findings and then go back to the theory. I think in a very fast changing and multidisciplinary field, the process is much more cyclic and much more entwined and much more iterative than that. I'm increasingly in favor of beginning with definitions. And definitions are, if you like, the simple part of theory, but remarkably difficult. We don't really know in our field when we're talking about children or adolescents or teenagers or youth or young people. We can argue those different terms carry all kinds of assumptions. We get confused about whether we're talking about technology or the online world or social media or everything to do with the internet. So concepts need to come first. And once we've specified just what we're talking about, I think it's much easier to move into empirical research whose scope is clear and whose kind of relevance is something that we can articulate rather than take for granted that we all share the same understanding. But even though that definitional and conceptual work generates, I think, some very productive debates among collaborators or scholars or people working together in a field. I would also say that in our field, we often end our thinking with the empirical findings and perhaps with their relevance for practice and policy. And I think it's important that we do more work to bring it back to theory, because our findings do help us clarify, for example, in research on digital skills, the empirical work we do can help us also clarify and develop theory about digital skills more generally, beyond children. It's relevant beyond children when we do work on children, and perhaps even also to a broader framing of thinking about the digital and about skills or literacies. So we don't always do that work enough. I would love us to do it more, and I would love us to come from the very specific research we do on children online to think and to speak back to all the different disciplines and theoretical bodies of work that we draw on beyond our particular focus.
I think it's very important when you're approaching a problem to break it down into what seem to be important subcategories, because you may need different variables, different explanations, different theories for different classes of cases. So an example of that in my work has been when we were doing research on sexting. We differentiated between what we ended up calling aggravated sexting and experimental sexting. So one's aggravated sexting being cases where, for example, there was an adult involved or there was a malicious intent by one of the partners in the sexting exchange. And those two kinds of situations require very different explanations. The thing that motivates the development of theory in my mind is when you're trying to explain something with older theories and you come across things that aren't really compatible with the theory that is being used. In my elaboration of routine activities theory, for example, one of the key examples of what was called, what was important in routine activities theory was this notion of lack of capable guardians, and it was theorized that people would be more vulnerable to crime when they were outside of their family domain. Well, it turns out that in the lives of children, they're actually more vulnerable to victimization at the hands of their parents and family members than they are of strangers. So you need to develop some components of the explanation that accounted for that anomaly. And that was where I develop some of my ideas of target congruence.
There is no answer for all my research. The abstract answer obviously is the process of producing scientific knowledge is a cycle. It's a constant cycle between theoretical reflection, empirical observations, testing empirical observations and implications in practical context, learning for theory, and so on. And given the particular situation at our institute, the entrance point into this cycle for different projects might be very different. So from time to time, we have the opportunity to do a project that actually enters at the point of theory. So we would like to be interested to test this kind of theory. In the majority of cases, I can say, due to the situation, it rather comes from interaction with stakeholders or with upcoming societal problems and challenges where we think we need to know more about that. And in that respect, even the empirical work is rather led by the observable phenomena. So let's take to get this, and then we turn back to our theory and add to the questionnaire or the research instrument some concepts that we know have been important in other circumstances, and we would like to check if they might be helpful to explain this one. In some cases, we end up at no, they are not particularly helpful, and so it doesn't work. It is not helpful. In some cases, I have to confess that we start from empirical observations and never end in a really convincing theoretical explanation. So that is part of our everyday life as researchers, that the ideal is not reached with each particular project, but overall, the idea is there's no alternative to these ideas of this cycle, and that all parts, all phases of this cycle have to be acknowledged, and with regard to their own right, to their own contribution to this process. The process is, the production of scientific knowledge needs all these phases.
I usually start any project, whether it's an experiment or a survey I'm going to do, with focus groups, because I always learn from talking to the subjects that I'm eventually going to study, much more than I've learned from the literature of things that I want to ask. So there was a lot of discussion about social media being difficult for children, and that at adolescence, and that it was straining relationships, and that it may not have a really positive effect. So we ran some focus groups, and one of the things that I've discovered that was kind of interesting is that two things. First, that in the focus groups, one of the things I understood is there's been an increase in the United States of suicides among adolescents, going down to younger and younger ages. There's an increase in depression. This was even before the coronavirus. And so there seem to be some mental health issues, and there's a lot of discussion about the relationship. What did I learn in the focus groups, and which I'll be pursuing nationally, is the context of living as an adolescent in American society today is very difficult. I was shocked by, of the 65 students that we interviewed, fully a dozen had experienced friends who had committed suicide, or they knew who were severely depressed. The context of, and another 10 or so were in schools that had full-time police pursuing them in the school system, in their schools, because they were worried about violence. That is not the kind of context that I grew up in terms of schools, that the reality of their lives, irrespective of social media, is difficult. Being an adolescent is difficult, and the coronavirus has just made it even more difficult, would be my view. So that's the first thing I learned, that it isn't always the technology or the use that they're having, that you have to understand the wider context of what the reality is for the kids you're studying. The second thing I learned is that much of the popular discussions about social media in adolescence, for instance, is all about is all about the older adolescents, and in particular the negative consequences. Are they going to run across pedophiles? Are they going to be subject to sexting that's going to pursue them when they try to apply for jobs or go to graduate school? How do they deal with cyberbullying? There are a number of negatives. I was struck in my conversations in these focus groups with a 13-year-old who said something most interesting to me that I hadn't thought of before, which was during the 2 hours of the focus group, she didn't say a word till the very end. Our last question was, is there anything that adults have wrong about social media and adolescence? And she finally said something, and she said, you know, you'll notice that I haven't talked very much. I'm very, very shy. I have difficulty meeting people. And if I meet somebody online first through social media, then when I meet them in person, I have something to talk about, and it's enabled me to make more friends in the real world. We never hear that kind of story in the popular press. And I was struck by the fact that one has to look at positives and negatives, and that one has to try to pursue the whole range of implications of how technology influences children's health and development.
I guess I try to do what I always tell my students, because this concept of theory as being a problem in research, or something that you need to be afraid of, or something that you sort of, you know, if I solve the theory, everything will be okay. I like to think about theory more as a warm, comfortable blanket that you can draw on top of all your chaotic empirical findings and make some sense into it. So theory helps for me to structure the discussion, or perhaps you could say the narrative. And when you work like with me, who's involved in the EU Kids Online Network, we have a lot of data, always. You could always find, you know, hundreds of variables that could go into a model, or there's all kinds of elements. So there is a sort of a chaos. And being able to use theory to think about what can we choose? What would be the most relevant? How is this story going to look like? So also to make it helpful for the reader and for people who can understand the conclusions. And then perhaps once you've done that, you can add some new and interesting things into the mix to see what comes out. And maybe you could even contribute to some theoretical development and saying, hang on, there's another element we didn't think about. Or often theories also are not intended to be used on this field, children and media. They come from other fields. So testing theories with our type of concepts and data and empirical work is fantastic, I think. And that also helps making us generally as media researchers more relevant.
I'm very deeply concerned to bring the theoretical and what we might loosely call the empirical together in my work. I think there's certainly room for very, you know, empirical and what we might think of as pure and applied, you know, mobilizing data in applied settings. There's also space for what we might consider pure theorizing, if you like. But to me, the kind of, I find my motivation at the intersections between those two things. So really for me, the question is thinking about how to activate particular theories in context, how to activate them for real world scenarios and to address real world challenges. And at the same time, I'm also always simultaneously trying to look for ways for the data itself to drive my theorizing. So I think it's not a straight, you know, theory doesn't emerge in my work, at least, or in my experience, in a very straightforward way. There's a constant interplay between theory and other sources of inspiration and grounding, if you like. I'm of the mind that if you can introduce children themselves to theory in a way that's, you know, in a way that makes sense to them, but gives them something to grapple with, then actually this is often a really nice thing to do in a participatory activity that's designed to generate data, is actually have children themselves grapple with theory. So, you know, I think we try and do that in all kinds of ways. We try to we try to sort of get them to think through power dynamics on the internet, or indeed the power dynamics that shape their the rules and regulations that their parents and others put around their digital practices. So we try and sort of activate theory, like, in that case, theories of power in a workshop setting with children, and to have them grapple with it and to speak back to it, so to speak.
My empirical research is the study of texts. I study very uncertain, very slippery, very contingent and movable sorts of entities. There's no such thing as a meaning. And so the very meaning of what's empirical is a bit different in my field from what it is in another field, where there are very strict protocols and rules devoted to what counts as evidence. Well, in my field, it's the attempt to discover what the rules are for setting rules that counts as evidence. And so, we're a kind of meta discipline in some ways. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but we're looking for models of culture, models of relationships, models of process in which you can try and understand how people make sense of things. And that's got to be uncertain, it's got to be contingent, and it's got to be relative, because that's how the world works in that context. Which isn't to say that we despise evidence, and it isn't to say that you shouldn't use evidence in drawing out your theories. But if theory and evidence are not integrated, then you don't get anywhere. The way I think of it is, if you're thinking, what are the rules that set the rules, then you have an opportunity to understand systems as a whole and how they are operating, where they might need system change, and how they are successful or not successful in various tests.